Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the space where we say, I can sleep. We have passed the midpoint of yet another month of 2023. It is now in the middle of August, which it should feel like autumn already, but unfortunately it does not. It still feels like midsummer, hot as HE double hockey stick. Yes, I just censored myself. Leave me alone. But I am lucky tonight that the night I am currently recording this, there is a nice cool breeze coming in tonight. So I am actually recording this on a rare cool night because we have been going through triple digit degree weather, my apologies. And that has not been fun. I feel like a baked potato every single day. So hopefully all of you guys are faring much better than I am. Please stay cool, stay hydrated, take good care of yourselves, okay? Now, as per usual, if you are enjoying these readings and would like for me to continue doing these readings, you can show your support by leaving me likes, leaving me comments, sharing my stuff, and following me on all of my platforms like Spotify at iKenSleep, YouTube at iKenWin, TikTok at iKenWin, and Instagram at officially.iKenWin. Now let's make our return into chapter 26, The Lost Red Pearl, Inadvertently Luring the Red-Eyed. Starting part 2. Fang Xin stopped too. After listening to Shilian's speech, he scratched his head. As long as you know what you want, how you go about it is your business. Right. So, where did Muqing run off to? Shilian asked. Just then, another couple of young trainees approached them, baskets in their hands, horsing around. When they saw Shilian, they called out to him in chorus, their voices happy. Your Highness! Shilian responded with a smile too. The trainees came up to them and thrust their baskets before the pair, saying happily, Will your Highness have some cherries? They've already been washed in the springs, very clean and very sweet. The baskets were full of small, round cherries, vivid red and looking quite adorable. Shilian and Fang Xin picked out a few to eat, and they were indeed juicy and sweet. One of the young trainees asked, When we walked over, we faintly heard your Highness asking about Muqing. Are you looking for him? I think we saw him when we were passing through the cherry wood. Is that right? Thanks for letting me know, Shilian said. Thus, the two hurried to the cherry wood. Atop Mount Taikang, other than the abundant wild maples, there were also numerous fruit trees, peaches, pears, oranges, and many others, including cherries. The fruit trees were nourished by springs, bathed in the mountain's mist and sunny dew, and bore fruits filled with spiritual energy. After offering a portion as tribute to the palace, the rest were reserved for the disciples in the temple, who could munch on them after a hard day's work. But outside the royal holy temple, it would be hard to buy even a single one with 100 gold pieces. The cherry trees stood in many neat rows, and within the fresh, new leaves drooped dozens of cherries like red coral beads, looking delightfully enticing. Shilian and Fang Xin walked for a while searching for Muqing in the woods, but soon after, they heard quarreling voices coming from just ahead of where they were, and they automatically slowed to a stop. Ahead of them stood 4 or 5 white-robed trainees, each with a basket in hand, appearing to have come to pick fruit. However, they weren't circling any fruit trees, but rather a person. Even from afar, their hearing was keen enough that they could hear clearly the particulars of the quarrel. One of the young men said, No wonder there seemed to be less fruit in the woods lately. So someone's been squatting here and stealing. A soft voice replied. The fruit growing on Mount Taikon can be picked by any disciple at the temple. So how is it stealing? Besides, there are hundreds, thousands of fruit trees here. There's no way there's less fruit by my power alone. The voice belonged to Muqing. From the sleeve corner that could be seen through the crowd, it seemed he had already taken off the black demon costume and changed back into his usual plain training outfit. The trainee humphed. Of course, if you were only picking fruit for yourself, there wouldn't be noticeably less. But you don't just pick for yourself, do you? You sneak them down the mountain for other people, exploiting your benefits. How shameless. Shilian understood now. The trainees who couldn't stand Muqing were picking on him again. Muqing came from a very poor family. His mother, who lived in the city at the foot of the mountain, led a meager life. In the past, she made a little money from occasional seamstress work, but after her eyes deteriorated, she could no longer even do that. She had to wait for Muqing to bring home the money he earned running errands on the mountain. Sometimes, he would pick some fresh fruit from Mount Taikon for her to try. It wasn't anything major since there weren't any rules against it, but when said out loud, it still sounded dishonorable. To publicly mock him over it like this was even more embarrassing. Muqing's voice was chilly. Zhu Xizhong, we rarely speak, but you pick on me again and again. Yesterday, you wouldn't let me through to Xishang Palace to pass on my message. How have I offended you? That young man named Zhu was indeed the trainee who had guarded the door to the Xishang Palace, and when he heard the incident from the day before mentioned, his anger flared. You're the one who carelessly messed up your job and almost botched that event. So why are you blaming me? You should blame yourself for acting all secretive and making people think you're up to no good. If you had just said outright what you were doing, nothing would have happened. Thanks to you, His Highness almost messed up his important duties, and I got yelled at by the state preceptor. As he griped, he threw the basket on the ground and motioned for everyone to surround and attack. Shilian couldn't watch anymore and shouted, Stop! The trainees were all shocked at the sound of his voice. They turned their heads and called out, Your Highness! Shilian and Fang Xin approached. By then, Zhu Xizhong had already grabbed Muqing by the collar and pushed him against the trunk of a tree, though the brawl had not yet started. If they really did fight, Muqing would have gained the upper hand, even 1 against 20. Nevertheless, if he wanted to stay at the Royal Holy Temple, he knew he must never raise his fist. Shilian smiled. What's everyone doing? Zhu Xizhong was a decent, plain-looking young man who looked up to the crown prince. Hearing Shilian's inquiry, he froze and quickly let go of Muqing. This? We were... Shilian continued to smile. Although I don't know why everyone is quarreling, Muqing is my personal... Although I don't know why everyone is quarreling, Muqing is my personal attendant. Anything he does is generally under my command. I didn't realize offense would be taken if I had him pick some fruit for me. The trainees all bowed. No. So it was His Highness who asked him to come. We misunderstood. On the side, Muqing leaned against the tree, at first taken aback to hear Shilian say he'd come under His Highness's command. He quickly fixed his collar, lowered his head, and didn't speak. Cold sweat was rolling down the backs of the trainees as they profoundly apologized to Shilian. then to Muqing, and finally picked up their baskets and hurried away, escaping the cherry wood. Shilian saw the basket Muqing had brought on the ground and bent to pick it up, passing it to him. Want some help? Muqing didn't take the basket, but he raised his head and watched Shilian with an unreadable expression for a moment before he spoke. Your Highness? What is it? Shilian asked. Why must you always show up at times like these? Shilian only made a sound of confusion, but Fang Xin grew upset. What do you mean? Is it wrong to come and save you? Muqing cast him a glance and took the basket. Just then, Fang Xin stiffened his neck and said rigidly, Listen up. What happened before was my fault. I didn't mean to accuse you of anything. I just made some offhand comments. There's no need for you to overthink it or suspect anything. I don't care for anyone other than His Highness, and I'm not interested in gossip. That's all I have to say, so stop being so difficult. At first, Shilian thought his tone was too aggressive, but toward the end, it became strangely funny. Muqing glared at Fang Xin, and Shilian waved his hand. All right. Everything Fang Xin said is true. Let's just forget what happened. Nothing's happened. A moment later, Muqing said begrudgingly, I'll look for that red coral pearl again later. Maybe it was dropped on the street. Shilian thought it might be a bad idea to appear that he didn't care, so he replied, All right. If you have the time, then thank you. But if it was dropped in the streets, somebody will have picked it up by now. It seemed Muqing had nothing more to say, so he collected the bunches of cherries that had fallen on the ground and put them back in his basket. He hadn't picked that many in the first place. As he moved to leave the woods, Shilian saw many more enticing fresh cherries and casually picked the bunch, dropping them into his basket. Muqing was slightly taken aback. Shilian said, Next time you want to pick fruit for your mother, just say you're picking them by my command, and no one will say anything. The state preceptor told me to return to the palace for a few days, so I plan on leaving tomorrow. Why don't you make a trip down the mountain too? But let's head back for today. It took a while, but at last, Muqing muttered in a quiet voice, Thank you, Your Highness. The next day, Shilian descended the mountain with Fang Xin and Muqing in tow. The moment they reached the foot of the mountain, they saw a shining, golden carriage right outside the huge mountain gates. A young man, dressed in a collared brocade top with a whip in hand, was lying in the front seat of the carriage. His legs were crossed, and he looked smug and important. The moment he saw Shilian exiting the gates, he leapt to his feet and ran toward him in a mad dash, shouting in obvious joy, Cousin Crown Prince! This youth was, of course, Qirong. Only he would have the free time to wait aimlessly for Shilian at the foot of Mount Taikang. He skipped over and happily exclaimed, My patience has finally paid off! Shilian grinned and ruffled his hair, laughing. Did Qirong grow taller again? How did you know I was returning to the palace today? Qirong giggled. I didn't. I just waited and knew you'd have to come out sooner or later. I refused to believe I couldn't catch you. Free, aren't you? Shilian said helplessly. Are you studying properly? What about sword practice? If Mother asks me to check your studies again, I won't make excuses for you. Qirong blinked, his eyes shifty. And suddenly, he jumped up and down. Never mind all that. Look at my new carriage. Cousin Crown Prince, come inside. Ride my carriage back to the palace. He grabbed Shilian's hand and pulled him to the carriage, but Shilian could sense danger. You're driving? Fang Xin and Mu Qing approached too. Technically, servants should sit at the front, but Qirong's face fell immediately, and he cracked the whip in his hand. I asked Cousin Crown Prince to get on, but I didn't invite you to. You think I'd let lowlifes touch my golden carriage? Get the hell out of here. Shilian quietly snapped. Qirong. Fang Xin had met Qirong many times before and already knew his foul mouth and vulgar, condescending attitude. But Mu Qing had never entered the palace before, and so had naturally never gotten the chance to meet Prince Shaojing. Qirong was feeling extremely aggrieved, but seeing Shilian about to walk away, he painfully and begrudgingly condescended to let the two shitty lowlives board his precious golden carriage. However, as soon as they entered the carriage, all three of them immediately regretted their decision. Qirong drove like a madman, whip in his hand lashing non-stop, screaming who knows what. The white horse shrieked in shock, and they thrashed down the streets with wheels spinning frantically. Qirong refused to stop no matter how much Shilian screamed for him to do so. They almost crashed into a number of pedestrians and stalls, and it was only thanks to Fang Xin and Mu Qing, who sat at the front and grabbed the reins to guide the horse, that this berserk journey did not cost at least 20 lives. When they finally reached the palace and the carriage slowed down, Shilian, Fang Xin, and Mu Qing all breathed a sigh of relief at the same time. Shilian wiped away his cold sweat. The other two had been lashed by Qirong's whip a number of times, and their hands were covered in welts. Qirong rose to his feet, one leg stepping on the white horse's behind. He proclaimed proudly, "What do you think, Cousin Crown Prince? I drive pretty well, right?" Shilian dismounted the carriage and replied, "I'm going to tell father and mother to confiscate your carriage." What? Qirong cried in shock. Regarding Shenle culture, first, they loved gold. Second, they loved precious stones. Third, they loved beauties. Fourth, they loved music. And fifth, they loved art. The palace of Shenle was thus the most distinguished place where all that they loved coalesced. Traversing the large courtyard, walking down the crimson hallway, not everything was gilded or built of jade. There were also masterpiece paintings hung all around, for example, and soft music wafted in the air. It created the illusion of paradise. The palace was Shilian's home, the place where he grew up. Fang Xin was chosen to be his personal guard at the age of 14, and had long since gotten used to these sights. However, it was Mu Qing's first time seeing such a building, and he couldn't help but be awed. Yet, the more awed he was, the more careful he became, and the more he didn't dare to allow others to sense what he was feeling. Didn't dare take a wrong step. Shilian went to meet with the queen straight away. She was resting at Qifeng Palace, leaning on a small tea table and tasting new brews. She had already received the message that the crown prince had returned, and with eyes crescent-shaped in joy, she extended both arms before her son even had come near. She said, "Finally willing to come home and see your mom?" Fang Xin and Mu Qing stood guard outside. Xilian entered the chamber with Qirong in tow, and he reached out to take his mother's hands when he approached. "Didn't I just come visit 2 months ago?" The queen grumbled. "What a heartless child. Even Rong-e knows to keep an old woman like me company. But here you are, sounding all self-righteous when you haven't come home in 2 months." Xilian chuckled. "And how is mother old? You look no older than a teenager. It's like we're of the same generation." The queen was very pleased hearing these words of praise. Even if she had a son as old as Xilian, because of her status and wealth as a member of the noble Min clan and wife of the king of Shenle, she was very well maintained and still looked the part of a noble beauty. Still, the word that left her lips was a light admonishment. Flatterer. Xilian glanced at the small tea table and saw a jaded cup, its contents emitting a strange fragrance. He curiously asked, "What's this?" as he picked it up. But the queen warned, "Don't drink it! It's not something you should drink." Xilian was curious. "Why can't I drink this?" The queen reached for the small jaded cup and took it from him, poured a bit of its contents on her handkerchief, and pressed it gently to her face a few times. "Mount Taikang recently sent a batch of fresh fruit. I don't like cherries, but there's a method of making them into paste for facials, so I squeezed some for fun. There's not much use for it, and I was about to have it thrown out. So you can't possibly drink it." Xilian smiled as he listened, but suddenly recalled the events of the previous day. There were very few times in a year where Muqing's mother could taste cherries, and Muqing himself was bullied just for trying to pick some. It was something of a sensitive topic, and Xilian was afraid Muqing would be uncomfortable listening to it, so he smiled and changed the subject. "Then do you have anything that I could eat?" The queen chuckled. "The way you make it sound, people will think I starve you. But you've been a picky eater ever since you were young. I can't plump you up. You've gotten so thin since you went to the mountain. Today, you'll eat whatever I tell you to, with no fussing." Mother and son conversed for a while, and the queen asked about the incident during the heavenly procession with great concern. "By the state preceptor's report, it sounds serious. What's going to happen? Will you be punished?" Xilian didn't have the chance to answer before Qirong cut in. That wasn't Cousin Crown Prince's fault. He wasn't the one who fell off the wall. If anyone must be punished, it should be that little non-croaker." What the heck is a little non-croaker? Xilian thought. Before he could correct Qirong, however, the queen simply laughed. Then, she happened to notice the two outside the manor and asked, "Who's the child next to Fang Xin? It's the first time I've seen another person by your side." Xilian replied cheerfully, "Oh, that's Muqing. He's the one who played the demon on stage yesterday." Hearing this, anger flashed across Qirong's face. The queen said, "Really? Have him come in so I can see his face. Fang Xin can come in too." Thus, Fang Xin and Muqing entered the chamber and knelt before the queen. She took her time looking over Muqing and said to Xilian, "I thought he fought rather well yesterday. A fairly respectable child. Looking at his face, you'd think he'd be a gentle minister. No one would suspect that he could be so tenacious wielding a saber." Xilian grinned. "Right? I think he's quite good too." Qirong, on the other hand, commented coldly, "Oh? The demon yesterday was him?" Xilian heard his tone and felt dread. Sure enough, the next second, Qirong suddenly exploded. He snatched the small, jaded cup from the little tea table and swung it right at Muqing's face. Here! Your reward! Fortunately, Xilian was faster. He smacked Qirong's hand, forcing him to drop the cup so the splash didn't make it to Muqing's face. Xilian pulled him back by the collar. Qirong, what are you doing? Even as he was seized, Qirong still ranted and raved. Cousin, I'm helping you discipline an impudent servant. Before you showed up yesterday, he sure was enjoying himself, hogging the limelight. Who do you think you are? The star of the heavenly procession? Gonna overthrow the heavens too? The queen was stunned. Ronga, what are you doing? Muqing's face was spared the splash, but his clothes weren't. Because the queen hadn't given him leave to do otherwise, he stayed kneeling on the floor, his face ghastly pale and gloomy. Xilian passed Qirong to Fang Xin. Don't let him hit anyone. Fang Xin only used one hand to restrain Qirong, but Qirong kicked and punched, spitting as he shouted. And who do you think you are to have the damn nerve to touch me so casually? Xilian could feel his head throbbing. Qirong, you're getting more and more out of control. He then turned to the queen. Mother, I forgot to mention something. Please confiscate his golden carriage. Shocked, Qirong yelled. No! No! Why? That's Yimu's birthday gift to me! Even if it is, it must be confiscated, Xilian said. We almost caused a disturbance in the streets. You'd best not touch it again until you learn how to drive properly. The queen made a noise of surprise and asked, Disturbance? What disturbance? Xilian recounted the crazy saga of Qirong's driving. Qirong was furious, his eyes rimmed in red. Cousin Crown Prince is wrong! I didn't run over a single person! Xilian didn't know whether to laugh or cry. That's because we stopped you. Qirong struggled out of Fang Xin's hands and ran out of Qifeng Palace in a mad fit, not turning back even when the queen called out to him. She said helplessly, I'll talk to him tomorrow about confiscating his carriage. She sighed. That child has wanted a carriage for the longest time, so when his birthday came around and he still desperately wanted it, I gave it to him. Who knew it'd turn out like this? Had I known, I wouldn't have done it. Why must he have a carriage? Xilian wondered. He said it so he can go to Mount Taikang any time to bring you back to the palace, the queen replied. Xilian felt silent, learning that at the end of the day, it was a gesture of goodwill. After a moment, he spoke. It'd be better to instead find him a good teacher and restrain that temper. He can't keep going on like this. The queen sighed. And what teacher can restrain him? He only ever listens to you, and we could hardly have him go to the mountain to cultivate with you. The state preceptor would die before taking him on as a disciple. Xilian found the idea both hilarious and horrifying. He shook his head. With a temper like that, if he entered the royal holy temple, he would cause havoc for sure. Both mother and son were deeply troubled by this, but they didn't have any ideas, so they let it go for the time being. That evening, after having seen his parents and caught up, Xilian rose to leave the palace. It was a well-known fact that the crown prince was obsessed with cultivation, and ever since he entered the royal holy temple, he visited his parents less and less. The king didn't comment much on the matter, but the queen was always reluctant to see him go. After leaving the palace, Xilian casually strolled around the imperial capital, accompanied by Muqing to visit his home, as he'd suggested the day before. The tall, opulent red gates and the impoverished slums were only a street away from each other. Muqing's former home was tucked into a dark alley off the most bustling area of the imperial capital. The three of them had just turned into the alley when 5 or 6 children in rags surrounded them. "Gaga! Gaga is back!" Shilian was a little confused at first, wondering why they would call a stranger Gaga. But then he discovered that the Gaga they were calling wasn't to him, but rather Muqing. The children called out to him sweetly, but Muqing ignored them. "There's nothing this time. Don't Gaga me so easily." His face was wooden, but his voice wasn't cold. He turned to Shilian. "Don't mind them, Your Highness. They're just kids from the block." Still, this group of children obviously knew him well, so they were clearly used to playing with him and weren't scared at all. They giggled and surrounded them, their dirty little hands extended, begging for treats from Muqing. In the end, Muqing reached for the gem-like red cherries in his bag and handed them out. Fang Xin was astonished at this sight, as if Muqing doing anything like this was nothing short of a miracle. It was no wonder, since Muqing's pretty boy face was always looking extremely selfish and cold-hearted. He seemed like the type that, seeing someone die from starvation on the streets, would still keep a tight grip on his own food. Shilian, on the other hand, wasn't surprised at all. At first, he also wanted to find something to give to the children, but he didn't usually carry sweets on his person, and having Fang Xin give coins would be too much like dismissing beggars. So Shilian didn't think it would be appropriate. Suddenly, there was a boom, and a cacophony of galloping noises from the main street, the long shrieking whinny of a horse, and people screaming. The three of them stopped, then Shilian rushed out of the alley. The main street was in chaos, stalls toppled, and people on the ground. It was total confusion. The pedestrians were all fleeing, and red apples and yellow pears rolled all over the ground. But before he could figure out what was happening, he heard the crazed laughter of a young man. "Out of my way! Get the hell out of my way! If you're that blind, I don't care if you get trampled." Fang Xin swore. "It's Qirong again." Sure enough, Qirong stood atop his magnificent golden carriage looking malicious. He was lashing his whip wildly, the white horse howling from the strikes. "Stop him!" Shilian shouted. The golden carriage whooshed by them, and Fang Xin acknowledged with an understood before charging on ahead. Shilian was about to go check for any wounded among all the toppled stalls and knocked over pedestrians left in the wake of Qirong's mad ride, when suddenly he noticed something wrong. He whipped his head around and saw that there was something being dragged along behind the golden carriage, attached with a long, thick hemp rope. At the end of the rope was a large sack that appeared to have something struggling inside. It looked like there was a person in that sack. At that moment, Shilian could only feel his blood run cold. The next second, he rushed forward. From all the whipping, that white horse was galloping like it was running for its life, furiously spinning the wheels of the carriage. Fang Xin was trying to hold the horse back, but probably wouldn't be able to stop it immediately. Shilian raced up to the carriage in only a few steps, unsheathed his sword, and struck down. The rope snapped in two, and the sack dropped to the ground, rolled, and came to a stop. Shilian bent forward to inspect it. The sack had been dragged for who knows how long, and was torn from the scraping. It was extremely dirty and drenched in blood. It looked like a bag of a dead body. Another swing from his sword, and the rope tied around the opening was cut. He opened the bag, and there was indeed someone inside. What's more, it was a young child. Shilian ripped open the entire sack. The child within was curled in a ball, hugging his head tightly. His filthy clothes were covered both in giant footprints and fresh blood. Even his hair was matted with blood. He was a mess, and it was obvious he had been severely beaten, so badly that he didn't even look human anymore. Judging by his size, he was only 7 or 8, and a tiny creature. He was shaking like a layer of his skin had been forcibly peeled off. Truly incredible that he was still alive after such a violent beating and being dragged through the streets. Shilian reached out a hand to feel his neck and found that his pulse wasn't too weak. He sighed a breath of relief. He immediately picked up that small body and turned around and barked a furious order. "Fang Xin, arrest Shirong!" He could not believe that something like this could happen in the kingdom of Shenle. Under the light of day, on the main street, a member of the nobility stuffed a live human in a sack to be dragged behind a horse carriage. If he hadn't seen and stopped it, this small child would have been dragged to death this day. From some distance away came the sounds of whinnying and the angry roars of Qirong, and soon after, Fang Xin yelled back, "He's being stopped!" Shilian rushed toward them just in time to hear Qirong's howl in rage. "You damned audacious lowly servant! You dare hurt me? Who gave you the balls?" Turned out, Fang Xin couldn't stop the horse, so he tried to snatch the reins instead. Of course, Qirong wouldn't let him, so the two pulled back and forth, and in a moment of carelessness, Fang Xin bumped him and pushed him off the carriage. Qirong fell to the ground and rolled a few times, scraping his knees. Seeing that he was surrounded by onlookers, he felt nothing but rage and embarrassment. However, Shilian cut in. "I did." Qirong opened and closed his mouth a couple times before finally crying. "Cousin Crown Prince!" Shilian said angrily. "Look what you have done! Qirong, I really..." Just then, he felt the child in his arms jerk. He had loosened the hands hugging his head and was peeking up at Shilian from the gap between his elbows. Shilian immediately restrained his anger and lowered his head to soothe him in a gentle voice. "How do you feel? Do you feel pain anywhere especially?" The child was amazingly still alert, not unconscious from pain, nor frozen in shock. He shook his head. Shilian noticed that what little of his face was visible was bleeding, and he was about to check for other head injuries, but the child firmly clutched half of his face with his hands, stubbornly refusing to show him. Shilian coaxed. "Don't be afraid. Everything's fine. I only want to check your injuries." The child, however, pressed his hands down harder, revealing only one large obsidian eye, looking panicked. But this panic didn't seem like it stemmed from a fear that he would get beaten, but rather that something would be discovered. Looking at this little face, half covered with only one eye to be seen, Shilian only realized he might have seen this child somewhere. He squinted as he thought. Qirong saw his upset face and explained. "Cousin Crown Prince, that little non-croaker ruined your grand ceremony yesterday, so I avenged you. Don't worry, I was careful. He won't die." Sure enough, the child held in his arms was the one who fell from the city wall during the Shangyun Heavenly Ceremonial Procession the day before. No wonder Shilian thought he looked familiar. This little child hadn't even changed. He was still wearing the same outfit as the day before. But because of all the beating and dragging, he was filthier, and the clothes, looked nothing like they had yesterday. He didn't even look like the same person. Shilian couldn't hold back his anger anymore. Who told you to avenge me? It has nothing to do with this child. It wasn't his fault. Qirong justified. Of course it's his fault. If not for him, you wouldn't have been scolded by the state preceptor. This ruckus was getting out of hand, and the crowd watching was growing, the onlookers whispering to each other. Just then, Muqing approached, and Qirong pointed his whip at him, expression laced with hostility. And you lowly servant! I can tell this one doesn't know his place just from the look of him. If you don't discipline him, sooner or later he's going to overthrow you and step on you, his master. I helped you discipline him, but you turned around and defended him instead, and told on me too. Now Yifu and Yimu are not only ignoring that I did it for you, they're even going to confiscate my golden carriage. Cousin, that was my birthday gift. I've wanted it for over 2 years. Muqing gave Qirong an unreadable, sweeping look. Shilian laughed from sheer rage. I don't need your help. Not like this. Are you really avenging me? Or are you avenging yourself? Cousin, why would you say that to me? Qirong asked, confused. And what have I done wrong in being by your side? Shilian couldn't talk sense into him. Qirong, listen here. From now on, you're not allowed to touch this child. Not even a finger. Do you hear me? Just then, Shilian felt a pull on his neck. He was wrapped up in a fit of anger, so it startled him. He looked down and saw that the young child had buried his face in his chest. His arms tightly circled around Shilian's neck. Shilian felt him shake uncontrollably and thought he was in pain. He asked hurriedly, "What's wrong?" That child was covered all over in mud, grime, and blood, filthy and unkempt. It all smeared onto Shilian's white robe, but Shilian didn't mind at all. He gently patted the child's back to comfort him and soothed him in a low voice. "I'll take you to the doctor's right now." The child didn't respond, but he hugged Shilian even tighter. He held on with a death grip and wouldn't let go, as if he were holding on to a lifeline. Qirong could see that Shilian wasn't going to acknowledge his goodwill, his heart solely with outsiders. And when he saw that kid sullying Shilian's robes with bloody, muddy smears, his anger flared. He cracked the whip to lash the back of the child's head. Fang Xin was standing to the side, and in a split second, his leg flew out and kicked Qirong right on the arm. There was a loud crack, and Qirong screamed. The whip fell to the ground, and his right arm dropped limply at an abnormal angle. He stood there, frozen in disbelief, and it was a while before he slowly raised his head, glaring at Fang Xin, enunciating each word. "You dare break my arm?" The words chilled them to the bone. It was only after he kicked that Fang Xin realized what he had done, and his face changed. But Muqing's face changed more. It was one thing for them to detest Qirong behind his back, but for a personal guard to transgress this badly and accidentally break the arm of royalty, that was something completely different. Shilian had his hands full with that child when it happened, and the path behind him was packed with onlookers. Dodging the blow wouldn't be easy, but he would have managed it fine given the chance. But Qirong had come at him with such aggression and so little warning that Fang Xin moved too fast without thinking, and Shilian didn't have the chance to stop him. Now everything was even more of an uproar, and Shilian didn't have time to think. His clothes were getting soaked with blood. If they delayed any longer, the child might die right there. Shilian made a split-second decision, inhaled deeply, and shouted in a clear voice, "Everyone, If you were pulled into this incident today, please record any damages or losses. I will take all responsibility without fail. Then he turned to Fang Xin and Mu Qing. I need to save the child first. Take Qirong away and don't let him cause any more havoc outside. Done with his instructions, Xilian ran toward the palace with the child in his arms. Fang Xin heard the command, his expression back to normal, and he picked up the raging Qirong before following Xilian. The soldiers guarding the palace gates thought it was strange to see the crown prince racing back, having left such a short while ago. But of course they didn't dare obstruct him. Thus, Xilian ran straight for the Imperial Medical Office and made Fang Xin and Mu Qing wait outside the door with Qirong under arrest while he entered the infirmary alone. The Crown Prince rarely returned to the palace and rarely gave orders, so the Imperial doctors naturally rushed over with due haste. Xilian placed the young child in a chair and said, Thanks in advance, everyone. This child was beaten by several adults, stuffed in a sack, and dragged through the streets. Please check if there are any head injuries first. That's the most important thing. Neither royal nor noble had ever brought in a wild, dirty baby for them to heal before. But the Imperial medical team also knew they needed to do whatever they were told to do. And they acknowledged Xilian's direction with a chorus of, Yes, yes, yes. One of them said, Put your hands down first, little one. Though the child had been docile in Xilian's arms up until now, he started struggling then and firmly covered the right side of his face, refusing to drop his hands. No matter how competent the Imperial doctors were, if the patient would not cooperate, there was nothing they could do. The doctors looked to Xilian. Your Highness, how? Xilian raised a hand. He's probably afraid of strangers. It's fine, let me. The child was sitting in a chair, and Xilian couldn't be level with his eyes, so he bent forward and tilted his head. What's your name? The child's large eyes stared at him intently, his obsidian black pupil reflecting a snow-white silhouette. This gaze, if it must be described, was exactly as Fang Xin had said, possessed by the devil. It shouldn't be the gaze of a child. It was a while before the child bowed his head. Hung. His voice was tiny and soft, a little mumbled. It was like he didn't want to tell, or that he was slightly embarrassed. Xilian only sort of heard the word Hong, the color red, and asked another question. How old are you? 10. The child replied. Xilian was only asking offhand, hoping to lower his guard. But hearing the child's shy response of 10, he was taken aback. I thought he was only 7 or 8, but he's 10? This child is extremely malnourished and emaciated. After a pause, Xilian smiled softly. The doctors will see to your wounds now. Don't be afraid and lower your hands, okay? That child heard, but hesitantly shook his head. Why not? Xilian asked. He was silent for a long time before replying. Ugly. His response was just that one word, and no matter how Xilian coaxed, he refused to remove his hands. Xilian promised that he wouldn't think him ugly, that he wouldn't look, but not even turning around would do the trick. What obstinance at such a young age! Without much choice, the Imperial doctors could only ask him a few questions, have him recognize a number of fingers, and make sure he didn't feel faint or have any headaches. Check that he was perfectly conscious of what he saw and what he thought, and attend to his physical wounds. As the imperial doctors worked, they all appeared confused, clicking their tongues in awe. Xilian stood guard on the side. Hearing their sounds of wonder, he asked, "How is he, everyone?" One of the imperial doctors asked, in spite of himself. "Your Highness, did this child really get beaten and dragged along the roads in a sack?" Xilian was speechless for a second. "Why would that be false?" The imperial doctor replied, "If that was really the case, then... amazing. I have never seen anyone so tenacious. He has 5 broken ribs and a broken leg, and many other injuries big and small. But despite all of that, he's remained conscious this entire time and can even hold a conversation while sitting upright. Even adults would find that difficult, never mind a 10-year-old child." Hearing how severe the injuries were, Xilian inwardly became even more furious at Qirong. He looked at that child and saw that he was sitting there on his chair as if he felt no pain, stealing glimpses at Xilian with that large, obsidian black left eye. When he noticed he'd been caught staring by Xilian, he immediately turned his head away. Seeing this, for some reason, Xilian thought the boy was both silly and pitiful. He asked, "Will his injuries heal?" One of the imperial doctors wrapped new layers of bandages around the child's head and replied, "Not a problem." Only then did Xilian relax. He nodded. "Thank you for all your hard work." Just then, an attendant entered to notify them of the imminent arrival of His Majesty the King and the Queen. Each of the imperial doctors immediately stood up and exited the imperial medical office to greet them. Xilian moved the child to the bed and said, "Lie down and get some rest." It occurred to him that the child was afraid of strangers, and all the people who would be crowding in shortly might scare him. So Xilian lowered the bedside curtains before rising to his feet too. A number of guards and attendants escorted the king and the queen as they walked into the hall. The queen's face was pale. "Oh, my dear child, why did you return so suddenly when you just left the palace? Were you hurt outside?" "Please be at ease, mother," Xilian said. "I wasn't hurt. It was someone else who was injured." Just then, Qirong cried out from the corner, "Yimu, save me!" Only then did the queen notice Qirong to the side, firmly held by Fang Xin and under arrest. And she was shocked. She was focused on the well-being of her son and had completely ignored everything else. But now that she saw, she asked, "Renge, what happened?" The king, on the other hand, knitted his brows slightly. "Fang Xin, why are you holding Prince Xiaojing like a criminal?" When His Majesty arrived, Fang Xin should have bowed in greeting like Muqing and all the others. But because he had Qirong in hand and couldn't release him, he was put in an awkward situation. Xilian spoke up. "It was under my command." Qirong held up his right arm. "Yimu, my arm is broken." The queen hadn't had the chance to sympathize before Xilian cut in harshly. "You broke an arm, but what about that child?" "What child?" the king asked. "A 10-year-old child," Xilian answered. "Powerless, vulnerable, and frail in stature. Qirong sent his subordinates to beat him. If not for the child's tenacity, he would have been beaten to death on the spot." Qirong looked like he had just heard a joke, his eyes widening. "A powerless, vulnerable 10-year-old child? Frail? Cousin, you don't know just how vicious, how savage, how spunky that little non-croaker was. He only pretends to be pathetic in front of you. I called for 5 or 6 guys, and they still couldn't catch the brat.
He thrashed and bit them until they were bloodied all over. If he hadn't angered me so, why else would I have dragged him behind my horse carriage?
Hearing this, both the king and the queen's faces fell. Xilian drew in a deep breath and shouted,
Enough!
Do you think what you've done is impressive? Qirong wasn't one to shy away from the limelight. He was so arrogant and ostentatious that there was no way the citizens of the capital hadn't seen him. And after all they saw, there was no reason he wouldn't become the talk of every dinner table conversation in the city. The king gave the queen a look, appearing a little grim. Take Prince Xiaojing away. Doctor, see to his arm. The golden carriage will be permanently confiscated. You will be confined to your palace and reflect on your actions for a month without release. The guard behind him immediately acknowledged the order and moved forward to take Qirong. Only then did Fang Xin let go. Qirong, however, no longer cared and humphed. Take it. Take it. I already knew today would be my last chance to drive it. The queen sighed sadly, hearing that he had no remorse or repenting heart. Xilian spoke up. It would seem that with only a month of detention to reflect, he will still do this again. There needs to be stricter discipline. Qirong was taken aback and stammered angrily. Cousin Crown Prince! But then he switched gears. Fine. I admit it. This time it was my fault. No matter how His Majesty punishes me, Qirong has no complaints. His next words changed the argument's direction. But shouldn't Cousin Crown Prince's servant be punished also? Yifu, Yimu, my arm was broken by that Fang Xin, you know. Hearing this, the king instantly shifted his gaze to Fang Xin, looking outraged. Fang Xin bowed his head, and Qirong imperceptibly shuffled 2 steps away. The king berated him coldly. Fang Xin, you are the Crown Prince's bodyguard. The Crown Prince treats you well and regards you highly. But have you forgotten your place? What is this arrogance? Your duty is to serve His Highness. Is this how you serve him? You dare raise a hand against the Crown Prince's cousin, Prince Xiaojing? At those words, Fang Xin was ready to kneel, but Xilian stopped him. No need to kneel. Fang Xin obeyed Xilian's commands first and foremost. Even under the king's orders, his priority was His Highness, and so he instantly straightened again. Seeing this, the king grew even more displeased. It's true that Fang Xin broke Qirong's arm, but the reason was to protect his master, Xilian said. Besides, Qirong was at fault first, not Fang Xin. So why must he kneel? It doesn't matter, the king said. Either way, he has offended Prince Xiaojing. There's a difference between masters and servants, a distinction of superior versus inferior. If I, the king, were to make him kneel, or even if I punished him with 100 lashes, there would be nothing inappropriate about it. Although the king wasn't as affectionate toward Qirong as the queen was, Qirong was still nevertheless a part of the royal household. He was never to be disobeyed or offended. Qirong knew this very well, and said with a sidelong glance, No need for a flogging punishment. He belongs to Cousin Crown Prince. I don't want to make things difficult. As long as he breaks his own arm and kowtows before me 3 times, I can let this go. The king nodded slowly to accept the decision. However, Xilian interjected. If you must punish Fang Xin, then you must punish me first. He is my servant. First of all, he's done nothing wrong, and second of all, if he was at fault, it was still done under my orders. I will take punishment on his behalf. Hearing him, rage flashed across the king's face. By and large, all fathers and sons in the world must go through this change. When the son is young, he idolizes his father as the greatest hero on earth, his own personal role model, and his worship is clear. However, when the son matures to a certain age, he starts to question everything his father does. This can even brew revulsion until, in the end, neither side will acknowledge the other. Xilian's fundamental objective for entering Mount Taikang was to improve his martial arts and search for the direction of his heart. However, he was never attached to a particular place where he trained, nor his identity. The so-called Tao of cultivation meant exactly what it said, to walk the path. As long as one's heart was set on the path with a singular mind, then training could be done anywhere. He didn't need to follow any dictated norms, nor enter the royal holy temple. But there was another reason why Xilian had begged and pestered them to let him train at Mount Taikang, and that was because he didn't really get along with his father. As the esteemed crown prince of Shenle, the moment Xilian was born, the king of Shenle had already drawn out every detail of the path of his life, neat and orderly. It was all right when he was still young. A child had few worries, and Xilian only needed his parents to build gold foil palaces with him, to frolic and play. As the years went by, Xilian saw more and more that his father wasn't only a father, but also the ruler of a kingdom, and many of their beliefs and actions no longer agreed. For example, the so-called royal authority was one of the things Xilian loathed. If they couldn't agree, then it was best to stay far away. Every time he returned to the palace, he spent time conversing merrily with his mother, but he never had any heart-to-hearts with his father. Neither of the two ever took the initiative to talk to each other, and it was the queen who always mediated between them. Father and son had maintained this stalemate for many months, and now, with Xilian stubbornly refusing to back down, the king said, "Very well. Take his place, if you must. Let's see if you can actually withstand it." "Of course I can," Xilian retorted. The queen saw the two of them butting heads again and anxiously intervened. "Why must it be like this?" Just then, Fang Shen, who hadn't spoken a word, suddenly raised his left arm and struck down on his right. There was a loud crack. The crowd was startled and looked toward the sound and saw that his right arm was drooping limply, exactly like Qirong's. Xilian was both shocked and furious. "Fang Shen!" Cold sweat rolled down Fang Shen's forehead, and without a word, he knelt down before Qirong and kowtowed 3 times before Xilian could stop him. Quite pleased, Qirong laughed out loud. "All right, I guess I'll forgive you. Why couldn't you have done this earlier?" Even though Qirong's arm was also broken, he looked energized and refreshed when he left, as if he had just won a battle. As for Fang Shen, he was still kneeling on the ground. Muqing stood on the sidelines watching, looking vaguely ashen, but his thoughts were otherwise unreadable. Xilian whipped around to face his father, yelling angrily. "You!" Fang Shen grabbed him with his left arm. "Your Highness!" The queen also put her hands on him to pull him back. Fang Shen had followed Xilian since the age of 14, and Xilian knew he was given preferential treatment by the queen. Fang Shen had only done this because he couldn't bear to see the queen sad over the dispute between father and son. If Xilian threw a fit now, then Fang Shen's efforts would go to waste. He swallowed his outrage, but the fire continued to burn inside his heart. The king finally looked appeased and left with a grim expression. The queen had always liked Feng Shen. She sighed. My child, we've wronged you. Please don't say that, Your Majesty. This was my duty, Feng Shen replied. Hearing this, Mu Qing's eyes flickered, and he seemed to sneer soundlessly. Xilin, however, closed his eyes. Mother, if you really can't handle Qirong, lock him up. The queen sighed, nodded, then shook her head and left as well. Xilin asked for one of the imperial doctors to tend to Feng Shen's right arm, and he apologized. Feng Shen, I'm sorry. Once the others had gone, Feng Shen immediately changed face and clicked his tongue. This is nothing. I dared to hit him, so why would I be scared of his revenge? After a pause, he advised. Your Highness, of course it's right for you to discipline Qirong, but don't be angry with His Majesty. His Majesty is the king, and the figurehead of the older generation, so he thinks differently than we do. Seeing the two of you fight makes the queen unhappy. She has her troubles too. But how could Xilin not know his mother had her own troubles? Qirong's mother was the younger blood sister of the queen, and they shared deep sisterly affections. When this sister was young and immature, at the first bloom of romance, she thirsted for freedom and broke off a good engagement to elope with a bodyguard from her palace, lured by his sweet honeyed words. Who knew that the one she had chosen was a villain? This daughter of nobility was stuffed into a shack barely better than a doghouse. And not half a year later, the villain revealed his true nature and his taste for debauchery. Once Qirong was born, he became even more abusive, beating and kicking his wife and child. Finally, the mother couldn't endure it any longer, and when Qirong turned 5, she dejectedly took him and ran away from home. Because she had long since been disgraced through that royal scandal, she closed the door and no longer stepped foot outside, spending the rest of her life in grim depression, only showing particular love and devotion to her only son. During an upheaval, Qirong's mother lost her life saving the queen. Before she passed, she asked Xilin's mother to look after Qirong. Of course, the queen did her utmost. However, it was still awkward raising someone else's son. Discipline was difficult. Too strict, and it would appear to be abuse. And considering familial affections, she could hardly be so harsh. But too lax, and it would lead to the kind of behavior seen today. And without restraints, it would only worsen in the future. The queen often wondered. She raised Xilin and Qirong almost the same. So why were their characters so different? Just then, Xilin suddenly remembered there was a small child still lying on the bed here in the medical office. He raised the bedside curtain to check, and that child had been sitting up since who knows when, looking like he'd been trying to peer out of a crack of the curtains. When Xilin raised the curtain, he lay down again obediently. Xilin said, "Did we scare you with that quarrel just now? Don't let it bother you. It has nothing to do with you." Your Highness, this child's wounds have been tended to. Now he needs quiet rest, one of the imperial doctors said. Xilin dipped his head slightly. Thank you. He then bent down again to ask, Where do you live? I'll take you home. That child shook his head. No home. Feng Shen approached, holding the arm that was now in a sling. No home? So he really is a little beggar? Seeing that this child was so emaciated and small, his clothes filthy and unkempt, it wasn't impossible to believe. If he had no home to return to, they could possibly leave him at the palace or throw him out on the streets. Xilian pondered for a moment, then said, "If that's the case, then let's bring him with us back to Mount Taikang." Unexpectedly, Mu Qing suddenly spoke up. "He's lying,"